Today's video does contain subject matter that some people may be sensitive to, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. Also, if you have a story you'd like to send my way, please go to astheravendreams.com and click the button to do so. And thank you. This happened in the early 2000s. At the time, I lived in Florida and was about 13 years old. It was a different time for sure, where a bunch of us kids would be outside messing around, digging in the mud, climbing trees, doing things that little boys did, all day and late into the night. And on top of that, it was usually without adult supervision. The neighborhood as I remembered it was pretty cool too. No one that was dangerous, just your average people like my own family. I say this because it was normal for us older kids to go off and do our own thing, as long as we came home by whatever curfew we were given. But after this event, I didn't like to be out at night anymore, and never without an adult. It was the 4th of July, and my family was having their normal party with other relatives. It was my parents, me, my 3 siblings, my grandparents, aunt and uncle, and their 2 kids. One of my cousins, Joey, was close to my age, and we were pretty much best friends. They actually lived a few blocks over, so I would ride my bike over there to play with them. So when they showed up, we immediately started showing off the fireworks that we had, sharing and trading the goods, and went around the yard for things to blow up and color with firecrackers and smoke bombs. If you've never taken your sister's old Barbie doll to stain with smoke bombs and blow up, then you were missing out. So, the day was going well, doing the day stuff that we were allowed to do, and then it started getting dark, so the adults were setting up their spot on the sidewalk where they would be watching the show. Of course, I was the oldest though, so we were always waiting to shoot off our stuff. After some time, one of my siblings started being a nuisance, doing things little siblings did, following me around, asking me to light off mine, copying me, the normal things. When I told my parents, we all pretty much got into trouble, and were told to stop arguing, or we would just have to go inside for the night. I was annoyed, so I just sat on the porch stewing, as Joey tried to cheer me up. We came up with a plan to get us away from the family for a while, and asked if Joey and I could walk down to the fireworks stand that wasn't far from us. After thinking it over, they finally agreed to let us go, giving me like $20 to pick up a few things that they specifically wanted, and we headed off, celebrating our small victory and having time to ourselves. Of course, we were still young boys, and were up to no good, and Joey still had his dad's lighter, so I brought some firecrackers for us to shoot off as we walked. We tossed a few in the road after a car passed, or threw some in the ditch next to the road as it had some water in it. If you've ever thrown firecrackers in water, you know the fun in watching it splash back up. So, the further we went along the sidewalk, the fewer streetlights there were, as there was a lot of agricultural land on the side. The fireworks stand was in an old farm supply shop that is usually empty until this time of the year. After we went over a small hill, we could see the building in the distance. As we were walking, though, we saw what looked like a person on the other side of the road up ahead. But the shape of them made us stare a little longer than we should have. They looked like they were wearing a thick jacket, or had a blanket wrapped around them. Again, it was July, and in Florida. This was not something you normally saw someone wearing, so it was definitely an odd sight for us to see. But we pretty much just left it at that. We continued on, occasionally looking up at them to see if they were still just standing there, when they started walking down the street in our direction, but on the other side of the road still. At this point, we had stopped talking, and we had reached the part where we were both across from each other, so we slowed to a stop to look at them. He was standing almost directly under the streetlight, but from what I could tell, the outlines and colors, they weren't from a jacket. It was some kind of fursuit. But it wouldn't be as weird if it was a set, though. No, this was creepier because you could tell that it was piecemealed together. The bottom part looked yellow or tan in color, and it seemed to look really dirty. And the top part looked purple or blue, and the fur looked longer or thicker, but also looked extremely matted. It kind of looked like a really old stuffed animal that was left out in the elements for days. Then there was the mask. It had a long snout like that of a dog, maybe, but the fur or hair was really long going down the back of the mask, and again, it looked like a mess. It looked like someone found different pieces of a costume in different dumpsters and decided to make it into one. And if there's one thing it succeeded at, it was looking unsettling. They turned their head and just stared at us, which is when we got a better look at the mask. But we really didn't know how to react other than to just stare back at them. Then they made some kind of aggressive motion toward us. Sorry, I don't know how to explain the motion he made, but it was kind of like he was telling us to back up. But he was growling as he did it. And this definitely made us jump up a bit, and then we decided we should probably keep going and try not to look at them anymore. We picked up our pace and again had started talking about the situation, but not long after that, we heard the quick shuffling of what sounded like someone running, so we turned around only to find this terrifying furry man running toward us. Yeah, that would have been terrifying alone, but they were running toward us on all fours. It was like they were galloping and the motion looked normal, other than their legs clearly being longer than their arms. So we did what any terrified child would do, and we took off running towards the fireworks building, screaming. We started hearing the growling sounds again as they were starting to catch up to us, but we made it to the building and quickly ran inside, as we saw several people turn and look at us in shock. An older lady then swiftly approached us and told us we would have to leave because this wasn't a place to mess around. We tried to explain to her what had happened, frightened that she was going to force us back out there with that thing around, but she looked out the door and told us that we could make our purchase, but then would have to leave afterwards. So we agreed. We tried to compose ourselves the best we could and walk around to gather what we wanted and what we were asked to get. It certainly didn't stop the lady from watching us the whole time we were in there, though. I'm sure we may have looked a little suspicious, as we did just kind of glance over a lot of the items to try to buy us some time, as we weren't ready to go back out there. After going over each aisle, we finally bought our items to the front and paid for them, trying to be as polite as possible. I asked the person that rang us up if they had a phone that we could use to call home, hoping that someone might be able to pick us up instead. Hesitantly, they brought up a cordless phone and tried calling, but to no surprise, no one answered. So, we decided it was time for us to buck up and head home. The only benefit this time was that we had more fireworks, including Roman candles that we were hoping to be able to fire at this person if they came back for us. We started our speed walk back to my place, trying to act cool and fine, but I know that I was still scared, and I know Joey was too by the look on his face, and the fact that we kept both looking around. Thankfully, my dad must have thought that something was up, and as we rounded the corner, I recognized his truck and we immediately ran over to it. We jumped in the back telling him that we already got everything and to just go home. When we got back home, we explained to them what had happened, but of course they didn't believe us. My mom and aunt kept claiming that we probably just didn't see the person clearly, and my dad and uncle teased that they were probably just doing it to scare people. But whatever the case, after that, I never really liked going outside at night, and I never went anywhere without an adult that could fight off some man-bear-dog thing. And the fact that instead of running at us like a human, they dropped to their hands and feet and ran at us is an image I just cannot forget. Joey and I still bring it up on occasion when we're together, and he remembers it just as I do. It still freaks me out to think what could have happened if they did catch up to us, and what their plans were. But whatever they were, I'm glad we ruined them, and I hope they weren't able to follow through with any other targets. This happened to me back whenever I was 15. My birthday is on June 23rd, and we had just had a family party for me, including dinner of my choosing, which was at my favorite Mexican restaurant. Then we went home, opened my presents, and had cake and ice cream. Afterwards, we watched a movie together and had more snacks like popcorn and candy, so I crashed pretty hard afterwards. It was a fantastic day, until I went to bed and had a horrible nightmare that felt so real. In my dream, my mom, dad, older brother, and I had all gone to get our fireworks for the 4th of July. We got the stuff we normally did, like smoke bombs, parachutes, fountains, the whole works. My dad always liked to end with the big show, so he bought a bunch of different mortars, letting us each pick out 1-2 that we specifically wanted to see. Then we would pick out some random little things here and there that they showed on their display screen, or anything that really caught our eyes. Walking down one of the displays was this piece that was honeycomb-shaped. The color on the wrapper, however, were golden yellow and orange, and the name was something to the effect of dancing bees, or similar. It looked kind of cute, and it made me think of my mom because she had a butterfly garden in our front yard that was always filled with butterflies and bees. She loved it. I called her over to show her, and, as expected, her face lit up. And she told my dad that she wanted to get it, so, naturally, we did. Then, when we started lighting things off, my grandma and mom were sitting in their patio chair on our porch, while my dad and brother were starting to light off the bigger mortars. I loved watching them, but I was still nervous about lighting them, so I just watched them from the porch as well. Then they got to the bee one that my mom and I picked out. My brother lit it and ran towards my dad, who was standing to the side near the garage. After waiting in anticipation, we saw the fuse die out with nothing more. After a few seconds, my dad agreed to go check it out, and as he approached it, there was a huge burst of light that came out of it, causing me to flinch. When I finally looked back up, my dad was on the ground with my brother standing over him, and that's when I noticed my hearing seemed to be muffled and was slowly coming back as I heard screaming around me getting louder and louder. I turned around to see my mom slumped back in her chair with something big smashed in her face. Then I turned around as I seemed to recognize the screams, which were coming from my grandmother. She was rolling around on the ground trying to put the flames that were seeming to engulf her. I just remember standing there frozen in place, not knowing what to do. Do I check to see if my mom is even alive? Do I help my grandmother? What about my dad? The next thing I knew, I woke up in my bed covered in sweat, and I just started shaking and crying. I had never had a dream or nightmare, rather, that felt so real. The terror was overwhelming. I could feel the heat of the fire and the splitting headache from the loud blast. But it was all a dream. I got up and turned on my computer to check the date and time, and to my relief, it was around June 24th at about 2 or 3 in the morning. I went to the restroom to splash water on my face to try and calm my nerves before I finally laid back down. I turned on the TV to try to get my mind elsewhere before I finally did fall back asleep, telling myself it was just a dream. I was 15, as I said, so I didn't really talk to my parents about having bad dreams anymore, so I just kind of kept it to myself, other than maybe a good friend of mine. They thought it was a pretty crazy dream too, but then we all moved on from it. It wasn't until a few days later, when we went to go get our fireworks, that it would all come back to me. We went on that following Saturday, when my dad was off work, to go get our supplies. We picked out our normal items, and then started looking at the mortars. I hadn't even thought of my dreams since then because, while it was pretty scary, it was just a dream. However, I would be lying if I said it didn't all come rushing back to me and make me hesitate when I saw that same dancing bees display sitting out. In this reality, though, I chose not to point it out to my mom. I didn't really believe in supernatural phenomena, or whatever you want to call this, but I guess the dream messed me up enough to steer me away from it. Though that doesn't stop other people, so when my brother noticed it, he immediately pointed it out to my mom. As expected, she liked it and wanted to get it. I was not comfortable with this idea whatsoever, so I tried all I could to talk them out of it. I suggested we get something else. I said the name was going to be misleading, and I even said I wasn't comfortable with it, or it didn't seem safe. My dad immediately pointed out that I've never really been afraid of fireworks to the point that I didn't want them to get something, and then asked me what was wrong. I didn't want to look dumb or be made fun of by my brother, potentially, so I just said it didn't look safe. As expected, my brother teased me about being scared while my dad tried to assure me it would be fine, and that we were all safe when it came to the fireworks, and they carried it off. I refused to carry it, and I made them put it in the shed in the back, as far away as possible from the house. So, the night of the 4th, we got all set up for our little show. This year it was only going to be the 4 of us, plus my grandmother. Sometimes we had friends or aunts and uncles that would stop over, but they all had plans this year. I did my best to relax and enjoy the night because I did typically enjoy this holiday, and I didn't want some dream to ruin it for me. I helped my mom and grandma set up their chairs on the porch, and we started lighting the fireworks. I was actually starting to have fun when they got out the dancing bees for my mom. And that's when it came back to the forefront of my mind, when I had that sense of deja vu as I walked out the door asking my mom where something was. In my dream, I had just walked out the door to ask her for something similar, and decided to wait because she was telling me they were about to light it off. As she started telling me they were going to light it, and to go get my grandma, because she had gone inside for something, I told my mom instead to come inside with me. She declined, saying she didn't want to miss it, so I tried to convince her to watch it from the kitchen window as it faced out into the backyard. She again declined. I didn't know what else to do, so I stood there next to her, mentally freaking out over a stupid dream, but something wasn't right. So as my dad yelled that he was lighting it and running off, I went back in the house, and then without thinking, I screamed for my mom to help me with Grandma. Sure enough, she did come running to me as I stood in the kitchen. When she came in and noticed Grandma was nowhere around me, she became pretty upset with me. She yelled at me like, "What's gotten into you?" And going on from there, when I heard my brother or my dad yelling. We quickly ran back outside to see my brother frozen in place, and my dad spraying the water hose over our little fireworks platform. Then, we noticed a big chunk of something on the porch that barely missed my mom's chair. It was still smoldering, so my mom had me run to get water to put it out to make sure it didn't burn anymore. Shortly after, my grandmother came back out looking just as confused as my mom. After we put it out, my dad explained to my mom what had happened. He lit the display, and after returning to where they were standing, they noticed that the wick had gone out. Then he noticed that we weren't outside, so he started walking towards the door to find out where we had gone, since this was specifically for my mom. When, out of nowhere, it exploded. They saw a few pieces go flying, but for the most part it had caught fire right where it was, so my dad rushed to grab the hose and put it out. After it cooled, my dad broke apart the piece that landed on the porch, and it seemed to be like a mortar shell of some sort that was warped, so it didn't seem like it could break open. This happened many years ago, so I don't quite remember how he explained it. But the scary part was, it would have definitely done damage if it had hit my mom. That is, if it hadn't killed her. I just remember shaking and crying when it all happened, and hugging my dad since he was okay. My mom then asked me what the hell was going on with me being so worried about this particular firework, and I finally explained the dream that I had. To my surprise, my mom and grandma looked shocked, whereas my dad thought it was strange and my brother didn't really say much. We cleaned up the debris from that nightmare and continued with our night, with my brother teasing me every once in a while with a, "Is this one safe to light?" But I was still on edge, feeling relieved that we may have avoided something much worse, and then also scared that I may have predicted this. Not long after the 4th of July celebrations, we started hearing and seeing in the news about fireworks accidents, such as fires, injuries, and death. And would you believe me if I said the makers of that stupid dancing bees was listed? We weren't the only ones that had something happen, where it ended a lot worse for them. And it kind of creeps me out thinking, what if they had some kind of warning like I did? Would things have been different for them too? I've never had a dream before or after that felt as real as that one, but it's just so strange that it happened. My grandma said that I probably have some kind of ability that I wasn't aware of before, and wholeheartedly believes in me. This is why I adore her. To be honest though, I don't think I want to experience that again. Seeing someone close to you die, whether in real life or a dream, can definitely be traumatizing. Oh, and always remember firework safety. I lived in a semi-smaller town back around 2014. It was one of those towns where everyone knew each other. We actually weren't allowed big fencing, but chain link was also a no-no, so most people either didn't have fencing, or you had to have one of the short brown or white fences. We had one on our place just to better separate our property line and plant other trees and shrubs without being told we were over our property lines. I bring this up just to show how open our yards were, and the overall lack of privacy. It wasn't a bad thing, though, because all the neighbors were pretty great, except your one nosy neighbor, but we just learned not to say much when they were around. Anyways, with this openness, people often had block parties or cookouts together, and they were a lot of fun. My wife and I were definitely the social types, so we typically attended them, and also seemed harder to avoid if we wanted to when she became pregnant. Everyone wanted to ask how she was doing, what our plans were for X, Y, and Z, and so on. After our daughter was born, it was just as fun as the other kids grew up with her and they all became friends. But, alas, every seemingly normal neighborhood has to have a dark side, right? There was a younger lady that lived nearby. She lived at the end of the block. I'll call her May. May inherited her house from her parents as her father had passed, and her mother had moved into an assisted living type of deal. They didn't want to sell the house, so they gave it to her, as long as she kept up on any maintenance that it needed. I knew this based on what she had told my wife, and when I was volunteered to help fix or look at something for her place. So, of course, May also showed up to the parties and was typically pleasant to be around. She could kind of get loud, but we never really found an issue with it. Some of the older folks and families with like 4 or 5 kids didn't care for her, or at least how she handled herself, but I just steered clear of her while my wife just thought she was trying to live her best years. Regardless, no one ever really had a problem with her beyond those situations. One of the bigger block parties that we had was for the 4th of July, of course. It was typically a bring-your-own fireworks and food, but there were a few cheap grills laid out for people to use, and they blocked off part of the road and had standing solar lights sectioning off parts of it so the kids could safely light off fireworks. And this year, my daughter was about 6 or 7, so she was just getting into really trying out anything, so we spent a lot of time close to her, of course, helping her light the little fountains and then running off with her. We tried to set in the idea that you don't have to be afraid of them, because she didn't like the ones with loud noises, but you also had to be careful and safe. When May showed up, she came over, said hi, gave our daughter a box of Poppets, and went off to greet everyone else. She had brought a bag of candy and small fireworks, and was giving them to the kids. As it started getting darker, one of her friends showed up, and that's when the party really started for them. And they started getting a bit louder, and really enjoying themselves, which was making some people avoid them. My wife was still welcoming to them, but we were still watching our daughters, so after offering them the chairs that we brought, since she also had a blanket to sit on, they accepted the invite, but said that they would be right back because May had to use the restroom. We were sitting almost across the street from our place, so my wife offered to let them use ours, but they insisted they would go back to her place, and then off they went. We continued watching the show, taking turns with our daughter, when her friend came walking back asking if we had seen May. We told her no, not since she left with her, and she said that she was gone when she got out of the bathroom. She said she thought she had walked back here instead of waiting, but was surprised to see her not sitting with us. So she walked back to her place after joking about getting lost in her own house, and left. A short while later, she came back again, saying that she still couldn't find her. We still hadn't seen her since around when they left, and no one else at the party had either. Everyone was doing their own thing now, so no one stopped to help look for her or try to figure out where she went. I remember when we were packing up to leave, the party was still going, but our kid was getting tired and cranky, so we decided to head out. At that point, we'd actually forgotten about the whole May thing until a couple days later. We were at home, and we had a cop knocking on our door. They said they were asking about May, as she had apparently gone missing the night of the 4th, under suspicious circumstances. She visited her mom almost daily, and she just stopped showing up with no warning. And her purse was actually found in a ditch, and all important belongings were left at home, like her keys and phone. We still hadn't seen her after they headed home that night, and hadn't since, so we unfortunately weren't much help. It was on the local news, but months passed and life just went on. She was never found and never returned. It wasn't until a little over a year later that our tiny town would get its answers. On my way to work, I saw several cops at one of the houses on the same street that we lived in. I learned when I got home that the guy that lived there had tried ending his life by sitting in his car that was on in an enclosed garage. However, authorities were able to get there in time to stop him, mostly because of the phone call that he made to 911 with a confession. He said he was going to take his life, as he couldn't live with the guilt of having killed May a year prior. It took a while for us to finally get all the information, but gossip moved fast in that neighborhood too. The guy was apparently driving intoxicated and was trying to turn down our block. May was probably already outside, ready to head back, and was in the road for whatever reason. We don't know, but this guy had hit her. We unfortunately were towards the other end of the street, and if there was any noise, it was most likely drowned out by the fireworks. The guy then picked her up, took her back to his place, trying to figure out what to do with her, where she eventually passed from her injuries. I believe the report said she had internal bleeding. He then buried her in his unfinished basement, as part of the floor was just dirt and sand. Within that time of him bringing her home, her friend was just inside, and came out looking for her everywhere. If she had stayed inside, or her friend had come out just a few seconds sooner, this all may have been avoidable. Hell, if we would have insisted that she used our restroom, it could have been avoided. And that really tore at my wife for a while. So, we found out what happened to her, which was heartbreaking. But we also knew this guy, as he was part of the community as well. He also attended the parties that we had, and sickeningly attended a get-together that we had at our place afterwards. This guy continued to parade around with the rest of us, and he knew something that we didn't. We talked about her on occasions with him right there. It must have done a number on him, though, as it was quoted on the news that he couldn't live with the guilt and wanted her family to have closure. There were so many emotions surrounding those 2 years, as the neighborhood seemed to crumble a bit afterwards. Some families moved out, including ourselves, because it was just a weird feeling. But the thought that we had a killer so close to us, on a regular basis, was genuinely terrifying. You just never really know a person, right? I have a story that happened to me and my wife back in July of 1998. We were both fairly young. I think I was 22 at the time, which would have made her 23. The two of us had moved away pretty much as soon as we could, and had made a comfortable little life for ourselves about 3 states away from where we grew up. Of course, this meant, and still does mean, that we have to fly back home anytime anything important, or worthy of celebrating, happens to our family. Well, in this particular year, my sister was getting married, and she wanted to have her wedding on July 3rd, which would mean that our whole family would be there to celebrate on July 4th. Normally, we hadn't flown back on the 4th, but because my sister was getting married, we were pretty much told that it was important to do so. So, we packed our bags and got ready for the trip back home. We had, of course, decided that flying would be our preferred method of travel, as neither of us wanted to spend a ton of time driving across the Midwest. This was also pre-2001, so flying was a bit more laid back, and there wasn't a ton of security to make the event stressful. We got to the airport and parked the car, and then got into the building. We got our luggage checked, went through the basic security checks to get out of the lobby area, where the gates are. By the time we were there and ready, we still had about an hour and a half before our flight. So, we decided to just kind of hang out. Again, 1998, so we didn't have phones or a laptop to kill time with, unfortunately. About 30 minutes into us sitting there, I had started to doze off, and my wife was pretty much nose down into the book that she was reading, when I heard a man saying something that I couldn't quite make out. I then heard my wife respond to him, and this made me jump up from my half-asleep state to fully awake. When I opened my eyes and sat up, I think I kind of startled the guy because he sort of jumped a bit too. When he noticed I was awake, he seemed to no longer be interested in standing in front of us, and kind of just shuffled away. It was weird, but I just laughed and then looked over to her and asked what the hell he had wanted. She said that he asked her if she knew how to fly a plane, and when she said no, he said that he could teach her if she was interested. And apparently that was the entirety of the conversation. I said all right, and then decided that it wasn't worth too much more attention, and that I would just go back to my nap. No more than around 15 minutes or so later, there was an announcement over the speakers at the airport that was asking everyone to remain where they were, and stated that there was a situation that was being dealt with. They then stated that this may cause delays, and apologized for the inconvenience. It was a bit strange for an announcement to be made to the entire airport, but I assumed that there was something going on with the systems, or air control, or something like that. We still had at least half an hour until we got on the plane, so I wasn't too terribly worried about the whole thing. That is, until about 5 or so minutes later when the police showed up. And it wasn't just 1 or 2 officers. It looked like it was the entire police department for the county. They were all wearing what looked like tactical gear, and several of them had the big guns. They were sweeping the floor asking people for ID and to see their tickets. Most people were checked, and then they were told to go to the other end of the lobby, and that was that. However, a few of us were checked and then told to wait by the opposite wall while they finished the sweep. Then, when they got those of us against the second wall, they started pulling us away individually and asking us strange questions. They actually pulled myself and my wife apart before they started talking to us. I remember the questions seemed incredibly strange at the time. The first thing the officer asked me for was my full name and address. Then he asked me where I was going. I told him everything, and said that we were going to visit my family, and he started asking me why we were headed there, who exactly we were going to see. Just a ton of really personal questions about our trip. Then he asked me if I was aware of what was going on, and I told him I had no idea. He then asked if I had spoken to anyone in the airport while I was there. At first I told him no, but then I mentioned that some random dude came up and asked my wife if she knew how to fly a plane. He nodded at my answer, and then told me to go ahead and get back with the group. Around this time, they had finished asking my wife the questions as well, and she went back with me to the wall. This was pretty much where we stayed for another hour, which put us as late for takeoff on our flight. But no one was able to go anywhere. The officers had put the entire airport on what was essentially a lockdown. Then, a little while after that, the announcement came back through and mentioned that we all needed to go to our gates, and that they would begin boarding specific flights and taking off as soon as possible. We got to our gate, and we waited as every other flight seemed to be boarding but ours. Then, we pretty much found out why our flight wasn't going anywhere, and why the police were scrutinizing our group more than the others. As we were sitting there, several officers came through the boarding area from where our plane was sitting, and they were basically carrying that man from earlier, the one that asked my wife about flying the plane. He was screaming incoherently as they took him out of the tunnel thing, and out of the airport altogether. Obviously, this was a bit strange. None of us had been able to board, so him being on the plane was a bit odd. After they had gotten him out of the airport, and as they were wrapping the scene up, I actually stopped one of the officers, and I asked him what exactly had happened. Thankfully, he was one of the cops that had questioned me, so he was willing to inform me. He said this guy had somehow gotten past the security people at the gate, and then managed to get onto the plane when only the pilots were on. He then trying to break down the door to the captain's area, saying that he needed to get in so he could fly the plane because he needed to teach his new girlfriend. Obviously, they put on the call with security immediately, but then they asked him about who his friend was and where he was flying to. He told them it was the pretty lady he just met in the airport. And this would be why they were asking my wife and I about the whole thing. My guess, they saw us talking to him on the security cameras and wanted to make sure we weren't in on some plot to hijack a plane. Thankfully, the guy seemed to be completely nuts, so once we gave them our information, and both told them that we didn't know the guy that was talking to us, they were happy with it and determined that he was acting alone. And that was pretty much the end of it. The officers stayed at the airport until all the passengers were on the plane, and we took off as normal without any issues. We were about an hour or so late getting in, but that really wasn't a big deal, especially since we now had one hell of a story to tell the family.
Oh, hello. I hope you enjoyed this collection of creepy 4th of July stories. I know I, Raven, have had not so creepy encounters on 4th of July, except when I get fireworks thrown at me. Yeah, me, Raven. Anyways, I hope you liked this collection of stories. If you did, be sure to like the video and comment below on your favorite one, or maybe you have a weird 4th of July story that you'd like to share. Feel free to do so. You can do that in the comments or on my website, my Raven website. Yeah, because I have one of those, because I'm Raven. If you would like to support the channel further, you can do so below with the join button for as little as $1 a month. You can get content like this, sometimes early, sometimes special stuff, because I, Raven, do special things. So yeah, there's also a Patreon option, which you can find in the links below. And most importantly, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. And until next time, friends, sleep well.